Hello and welcome to my summary and commentary on Part 7 of the Introduction to Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. This is a pretty long section, and there's some pretty important material in here, but I'll try to cover it as concisely as I can and comment on it as concisely as I can. So he begins by stating that the Magian culture, and the Magian culture in Spengler's conception starts around 0 AD. So Jesus Christ is a very important figure in the springtime of the Magian culture. And he views this as totally independent of the Western or the classical culture, which we'll get into more later in the work. But he sees the Magian culture as the first to develop a periodic world history. And if you'll remember back to an earlier section of the introduction, he discussed that the classical world had a polar view of world history. That is, the present moment and then everything else, virtually. A mythical past and an undefined future, you could say. Whereas the Magian, we get our first periodic world history in Spengler's conception. And he says this first appeared in the post-Cyrus Persian and Jewish apocalyptic literature. So this would be the pre-Magian phase. In Spengler's conception, each major culture is going to have this kind of tentative period of at least a few centuries, maybe up to a millennium, I think, where the culture isn't really in its springtime yet, but the thoughts, the key prime symbol or prime symbols of that culture are gestating, we could say. They're fermenting, to use another metaphor. So after Cyrus, so Cyrus the Great, big king in the Persian history, shortly before the Persian invasions of Greece, so a little bit before 500 BC, I think about 550 BC is a good date to think of. So this apocalyptic literature is very important to Spengler. He sees this apocalyptic literature as really defining the Magian soul to a large degree. And he discusses the Book of Daniel's 4 world eras, and that they developed into a world history for Eastern Gnostics. So that's something that interests me, these little Spenglerian comments on Gnosticism. Because from a view like Eric Voegelin's view, you could view Spengler himself as a bit of a Gnostic, and that's something I'd like to discuss further, but that's beyond the scope of this video. So this Magian world history is defined by a supremely dramatic act. It's an epochal, redemptive change of phase once whatever messiah for this Magian faith comes along. So the most famous, of course, is Jesus Christ. And look at our calendar even today. Even today, this periodic world history is still reflected in our culture because we have before Christ and Anno Domini, right? BC and AD. So that's quite interesting to me. Spengler didn't mention that exactly, but so I think we have a clear remnant of this Magian periodic world history in our very calendar to this day. On to the second point. The Western added a third epoch that he called modern to this kind of biphasic Magian view of the pre-redemption and the post-redemption. And the Western man, he's now added this modern epoch. And this transformed a unique divine act as the turning point of history into a linear progressive history. And he says, now Homer and Adam have been replaced by Indo-German, Old Stone Man, and Pythic Anthropos. So Pythic Anthropos would be ape man. Pythicus is ape in Greek, and then obviously Anthropos. So it's like Australopithecus was a very important find, the southern ape, and that's where Australia gets its name from, is Australo is south. So anyway, so on to the third point. Then he mentions this third kingdom concept, and that has some very haunting historic overtones because obviously the Nazis thought of themselves as the third kingdom, the Third Reich. So this third kingdom idea that exists in Western, ancient, medieval, modern schemes. There's some fulfillment towards a climax here, some culmination. And what the third kingdom is, everyone from a schoolman to present-day socialists thinks he knows. And he'll get into that a little bit more. So these are all these kind of utopian visions where, whether it's Hegel or whether it's Marx, some kind of great realization will happen in the future that will make everything so much better. And these people who have this gnosis, who are initiates in these, great ideologies, they know what the final state of history will be. Spengler rejects that. So he says, simply taken the spirit of the West as reflected in his own brain for the meaning of the world. So these people who think of the third kingdom concept, who think of this culmination, they've simply taken the spirit of the West as reflected in their own brain for the meaning of the world. And, I think, there's a lot to support that. So on to our fourth point. Oh, this is my favorite part. He says, Evidently, the mystic number 3 applied to world ages has something highly seductive for the metaphysician's taste. History was described by Herder as the education of the human race, by Kant as an evolution of the idea of freedom, by Hegel as a self-expansion of the world's spirit. So he's bringing up these, great late 18th and early 19th century philosophers. Now, some of them I don't think are so great, but of great importance to modern thought. And I just love that he's talking about how it's just highly seductive for them. So he certainly has an understanding about kind of how facile and how superficial these kind of German world histories from the 19th century that still plague our world to this day, how superficial and how facile they were. And that's a real strength of Spengler, and why so many people in this day and age are finding him to be someone that speaks to them. And then the one person who's really missing there, though, he doesn't say anything about Marx, and that kind of surprises me, because, Marx, maybe it doesn't fit into Triphasic, because he has more phases and everything, but it's so similar to Hegel in the way he turns the dialectical, the idealism of Hegel upside down with his dialectical materialism, and he still views this kind of utopian world communist state as this end state, and it's just so highly Eurocentric, so superficial, so naive, such a racket. And that's really where a guy like Eric Voegelin is of immense value. So then he speaks about Joachim of Floris as a key figure in this transition from the Magian biphasic world history, pre-redemption and post-redemption, turning into this ancient medieval modern scheme. So Joachim of Floris, Spengler calls him the first thinker of the Hegelian stamp, that he shattered the dualistic work of St. Augustine. And this is very interesting because Eric Voegelin also speaks a lot about Joachim of Floris towards the end of Science, Politics, and Gnosticism. So I just thought that was very interesting because they come at it in two different ways, obviously. Spengler is focusing on this ancient, medieval, modern trichotomy here. And Voegelin is focused on these Gnostic mass movements of the 20th century that, destroyed Europe. Killed tens of millions of people, ruined hundreds of millions of lives. And it's just interesting because I think there are really two ways of talking about the same thing, and this guy Joachim of Floris is a really central figure in both. And Spengler thinks that Joachim of Floris had a huge influence on Franciscans, Dominicans, Dante, St. Thomas Aquinas. He had an influence on their inmost souls, Spengler says. And this awakened a world outlook that's dominated Western concepts of world history ever since. And here, just an aside, he touts Henrik Ibsen's Maximus from Emperor and Galilean as a perfect representation of the Gnostic worldview. So I went and I bought that play, and I'm just digging into it now, and I'm very excited to learn more about this Maximus character. And again, it's interesting to see Spengler discussing Gnosticism and Hegelianism, because there's a lot of evidence that Spengler doesn't really fully overcome Gnosticism or Hegelianism, and we can discuss that further. Anyway, Joachim of Floris's world history and other mystical Eurocentric conceptions, they all assume that the West signals the finality of history, signifies the finality of history. And that's pretty common for any culture. You're going to view your own culture as signifying very important things. That's the nature of being human. But he calls these indefensible methods of presenting world history. He wants to get past any Eurocentrism, as we saw very clearly in the very last section, or the section directly preceding this one, I could say. And he says, you cannot make specific catchwords the criterion to judge millennia. And I thought that was brilliant. You cannot make these buzzwords of whatever they may be the criterion to judge millennia, to judge other cultures. So I thought that's very strong. And he says, this is because their will is different than ours. Their purposes are different than ours. And we must realize this for good world history. And this is where he's really strong, and this is where he's more sophisticated than the modern postmodernists. They reify their postmodernism into these senseless, let's just put that to one side. I don't want to keep talking about these people because they are the most boring and most annoying people who have ever existed. But this is really important for his psychological, phenomenological, comparative approach. He's looking at what is the will of these other cultures? What are their purposes? How can we actually understand them? And he's making the effort to dig into their minds through their art, through their religion, through the deepest aspects of these cultures. He wants to create a psychological portrait of these cultures. And to his credit, he also says that this is kind of the Western way of looking at history. This is what a Western guy would do, because we love to catalog things and dig into things, and not every culture is going to love that sort of thing. There's more dreamlike cultures, like the Indian culture, like the classical culture, that have a more ahistoric spirit, whereas not only do we want to understand our own history, we want to understand the history of the whole planet, the history of the whole universe, the history of every other culture. And this is what Spengler's trying to do. He's trying to understand world history, the history of every culture, and how they fit together. On to the fifth point, which I think is a fascinating point. He says, no one has seriously considered that arts may have an allotted span of life. So this is entirely consistent with Spengler's whole project. If a whole culture, then becoming a dead civilization, the thing becoming to the thing become, if a whole culture has a lifespan and can die, well then certainly the arts of any culture, the techniques of any culture, will have their own lifespan and they will die. So he criticizes any total history of an art. He says, no. There cannot be a history of painting. There cannot be a history of sculpture. There cannot be a history of any other specific form of art. There is a history of classical sculpture. There is a history of Western painting. There is a history of Western sculpture even. And he views like Michelangelo as someone who's trying in vain to recreate the classical sculpture, but in this Western soil, you can't really have the classical soul, and that's something he'll get into later, but just a fascinating general point that, perhaps you can't look at the total history of any art. You can't look at the total history of any science. So he would say, no, there's classical physics and there's Chinese physics or things like that. Now, when it comes to sciences, I think there's more reason to push back. With arts, because arts are inherently subjective and phenomenological, I think his argument's a lot stronger with respect to pure arts, not technical arts. But with respect to technical arts, with respect to technology, science, I reject his relativism. He's got an absolutely relativistic view of arts and sciences in each culture. When it comes to the arts and to religion, there's much more reason to view things in this absolutely relativistic way that Spengler does. But when it comes to where the rubber hits the road, when it comes to 2 + 2 = 4, right? No, that's a fact for everyone. Mathematics, there are truths. Science, there are truths, and we can get to them. And to completely reject that, it's an overreaction to these kind of nonsensical, overly systematized Germanic systems from the 18th and 19th century, people like Immanuel Kant and others who are focused way, way, way too much on systematization, on a priori knowledge, on things like that. So Spengler's overreacted against that by this intense cultural relativism that even says that technical knowledge itself is relative. On to the 6th point. We know it to be true of every organism that its lifespan is determined by the properties of its species. So that's just a short point, but this really gets to the heart of what he's thinking. Each culture is its own organism, and its lifespan is determined by the properties of its species. So each culture is its own organism, but they're all part of the same species of human cultures, we could say. And each one, based on his historical study, doesn't have more than 1,000 years of vitality in it. And that's his position. So on to the 7th point. He says, unbridled optimism sets at naught all historical, i.e. organic experience. It rests not on scientific proof, but on predilection. And this is almost foreshadows a very famous quote. I believe it's from Man and Technics, but it might be from The Hour of Decision. And he said some pretty similar things in those books. I actually think The Hour of Decision is a much better book, even though people like Man and Technics. Hour of Decision's much longer. It's like 200-some pages. Man and Technics doesn't even weigh in at 80 pages. I mean, it's just... And if you compare it to later works on technology, I mean, it's very thin. It's very... thin in the metaphorical sense as well. It's just not that well thought out. Hour of Decision, there's a lot that you can disagree with in it. Certainly a lot to disagree with in Hour of Decision. But he's touching on so much more interesting concepts. He's presenting much more interesting ideas in Hour of Decision than he is in Man and Technics. But there's a very famous quote from Man and Technics, I believe it's towards the back of the book, where he says, optimism is cowardice. Optimism is cowardice. What a German. What a guy. So this is foreshadowing that. We can't have unbridled optimism that the West will continue growing forever. No living thing continues in its growth phase forever. And the West is reaching that tipping point now. That's Spengler's view. And with how we've seen the world develop in the 100 years since Spengler wrote this, approximately, there's a lot to support his view, right? That's why people are rediscovering this work. That's why it's gaining popularity, because... well, people aren't too optimistic these days about the West, and we've seen this loss of vitality in every single way in our culture, just from birth rates going down, from the rate of technological progress decreasing, from the fact we have this kind of refried dog shit entertainment industry that is just a disgrace to everyone on Earth. And so, Spengler's got a lot to say, and we can't have unbridled optimism. Unbridled optimism is unbridled foolishness in today's world. On to the 8th point. He says, mankind is a mere zoological expression, an empty word. And he says, mankind has no aim, no idea, no plan, any more than the family of butterflies or orchids. And there's a lot of rhetorical force to this point, and I think the point is something to meditate on, certainly, because when these cultures and their prime symbols are that different, you could say, yes, they don't have the same aims, they don't have the same ideas, because the prime religious ideals that are actuating every culture, that create that coherence for the culture and create the pursuit of the ideal for that culture, they're very different, and they lead to very different ways of thinking. And as we see, it's our ways of thinking, it's our culture that really differentiates us, and this has all been borne out, because look at the two most genetically different people on Earth are not very different. They might look different, they might look vastly different, but they're really not that different. And we know that from DNA. But what makes people so different are their habits, their culture, what they do day by day. And this is part of why humans are able to adapt to every environment. You have people living up in the Arctic Circle. You have people living at the equator. You have people in every environment, because we have this plasticity, this neuroplasticity, where our culture can carry so much information that helps us adapt to our environment. And it makes different cultures that much different. But it's not in the DNA, it's not in the soil, it's in the ideas, it's in the habits. Anyway, I do wonder if he's made a mistake here, or a little bit of a confusion of categories here, because he's saying mankind has no aim, no idea, no plan, any more than a family of butterflies or orchids. Now, it depends how he's using family here. If he's using family in the sense of biological taxonomy, then he's comparing apples to oranges, because humankind is one species. Like, that's just a fact. We are one species. But our family is hominidae. What's that? That's the great apes. Hominidae. That's the great apes. So if he's saying a family of butterflies or orchids, and he actually means the family, well, then that would be like comparing us to the great apes. Of course there's no ape kind. But is there a mankind? I think so. Despite all our differences, yes, I think so. And so this guy's got a clear opposition. Spengler's clearly opposed to any idea of brotherhood of man. I mean, the guy is unchristian through and through. I mean, this guy does not believe in any brotherhood or sisterhood of humankind. And I think it's largely because of category confusion. Spengler is not strong with biological concepts, full stop. The guy is not good with biology, okay? He wouldn't be pursuing this comparative Goethean morphological approach if he knew biology better. He sneers at biological concepts that he scarcely understands, and it's the greatest weakness throughout his work. So that's just one thing to consider. On to the next point. In place of linear world history, Oswald Spengler sees the drama of a number of mighty cultures, each springing with primitive strength from the soil of a mother region. This is it. This is Spengler in a nutshell. There's no linear world history. There is the drama of mighty cultures, a handful of them, each springing with primitive strength from the soil of a mother region. And he'll get into that more, and it gets really mystic because he views the culture as being very tied to the soil, like the terroir. And he views the soil as even influencing the culture to some degree, and he makes these great comparisons of a plant to a culture, and it's airy-fairy. Like, it's just German mysticism at the end of the day, and, I mean, come on. Anyway, so he says, each high culture stamps its members with its own image, idea, etc. And I do agree with this. And we can look at mimetic theory as maybe a lens to look at this. You know, once a meme gets into your head, once an idea gets into your head, it can have a huge effect on you. As I was just saying a few moments ago, when I'm talking about the importance of culture, the importance of habits, the importance of the ideas that you possess in your head, immensely important. And insofar as Spengler's just saying that the culture rises out of a prime symbol, he's got a lot, there's a lot of truth to this. And he says, each art and science differs in its deepest essence. So we're getting back to his point that there's no total history of art. Each differs in its inner essence, its deepest essence in each high culture. And each is limited in duration and self-contained. Like each plant has a peculiar blossom or fruit. So again, he's always wanting to compare the cultures to plants. In some ways, it's a good comparison, but I think he gets lost in his comparisons at certain points. And finally, he says the high cultures are sublimated life essences, and they grow with superb aimlessness. Now, I don't quite understand what he means here by their sublime essences that grow with superb aimlessness. Because he views everything that develops in a culture in other sections as all being manifestations of this prime symbol. And if they're all manifestations of this prime symbol, they cannot grow aimlessly. This prime symbol directs their growth. So he seems to be contradicting himself a little bit here, and the sublimated life essences, kind of a Freudian sound to it, sublimated life essences. And we see some Freudian concepts influencing Spengler throughout his work, particularly Totem and Taboo in Volume 2. So just something to think about. And he says, cultures belong like plants and animals to the living nature of Göthe. And this is Spengler. Physics and chemistry, that's the world of systematics, the world of nature. But history and biology, no, those are world as history. That's where we cannot have a systematic approach. That's where we need to have a physiognomic approach, physiognomic tact. But is this just that he just loves Goethe too much? And hey, Goethe's a great artist. Because of reading this book, I started reading The Sorrows of Young Goethe. And that's a great book. I mean, it's a tremendous little book. And the man's a great artist. There's no doubt. But Spengler loves Goethe too much. And it influences, it clouds his vision. His love of Goethe clouds his vision. And he cannot see clearly. He cannot. I am completely convinced of that this man does not fully see things clearly. He's a great paradigm. He's a great window onto the world. Spengler's someone we need to consider. But he does not see everything because he assumes it is axiomatic for him that Goethe is correct and that Darwin is wrong. Darwin is of no value and Goethe is of infinite value. That's his presupposition, and there is nothing that can shake him in that faith. The final point. He says, the ancient medieval modern is particularly untenable now that evidence of other cultures is available in such great quantities. And this is a good point. And then he kind of chides and makes fun of these kind of Hegelian-style histories. But he also compliments Hegel for his honest avowal that he's just not even going to consider other cultures. That's what Hegel says. He says, well, you know, I'm just not even going to consider these other cultures. I've just got my triphasic history where the world as idea is going to realize itself. And that's all Hegel really cares about. So, a bit of praise for Hegel, but probably a bit of barbed praise. And to the extent it is barbed, I can support it. So, with that, let us conclude this exciting section of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. Thanks so much for your time. Have a great day.